Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for finding some time amongst your extraordinarily busy diaries on a Wednesday morning to join Campbell Tickell and us for this webinar, where we're going to explore the new British Property Federation's Code of Governance for for-profit providers. It's been a long time coming. The first conversations I had with colleagues at the BPF about a bespoke code of governance for the profit sector were probably about 3 years ago now. So it has taken some time, and we can explain why it's taken so long over the course of the webinar. But before we get sort of stuck into the meat of the webinar, a few housekeeping things to commence with. I will be chairing this morning's event, but very quickly I'll be handing over to Greg and to Ceri from Campbell Tickell, who will be running the webinar. We're going to split this into three broad sessions. Greg's going to explain the state of the market and where we're at. Ceri is then going to guide us through the code, and then we've got some time right at the end of the session for some questions and some answers and hopefully some debate. Those of you who joined promptly would have seen already that we've got some homework for you while you listen to us, and we've got a poll up on the screen for you to answer. As I said earlier, this is completely anonymous, so we won't hold anybody to the answers. But I think it's quite important for us just to shape the Q&A session later, if we can sort of get a sense of an understanding amongst you about the code and what we're trying to do. And then we can then sort of shape some of the debate later on about that. So a few housekeeping things before we get stuck in. We are recording the webinar. And we're going to make that available to you after the event alongside a PDF of Greg and Ceri's slides. You can enable captions yourself, and the auto subtitles then will flow for you. Please use the Q&A function if you've got questions for Greg, Ceri, or I. We're not using the chat function, but a bit like Slido, you can like or upvote somebody else's questions. So if there are themes that emerge during the morning, then we can make sure that we address those points. Please, can I ask you all to be on mute? I would also say that there is no video function for attendees, but you should be able to see all of us. Obviously, if there is some tech problems and you can't see us, then use the Q&A function and let us know. We will do our absolute best to answer all your questions. Appreciate that we won't have the time to get into the detail of everything, but I think Greg and Ceri will kick me under the virtual table if I get this wrong. But if there are specific questions or concerns that you have, then do reach out to us and we'll do our best to answer those offline. And then, like all good webinars and seminars, it would be good to hear from you at the end of the event about how we did, what we did well, what we could have done better. And I suppose, look, I mean, that sort of segues quite neatly into one of the key messages that I wanted to get across before I hand over to Greg, which is, whilst Greg, Ceri, and I have done a huge amount of stakeholder engagement when we've devised this code, I think one of the things that we're acutely conscious of is the fact that we won't have got this 100% right first time round. And it won't be until you and your boards and when those of you who are board members start deliberating and hopefully adopting the code, that some of the nuances and some of the issues that flow from the code come out. So if when you start looking at the code and you move towards implementation, there are issues, please do reach out to us, and we can make sure that when we come to version 2.0 of the code, we can take that feedback into account. But I genuinely do think that we're in a good place to start with. As I said at the outset, this has been a long time coming. It's been a hobby horse of mine for the last 3 years, and I think I'm saying this very much with a BPF hat on rather than a Trowers hat. There was a real sense amongst the BPF's Affordable Housing Committee that the time was right for a bespoke code for this sector, and I think there are two, probably three fundamental reasons for that. It always felt a little bit uncomfortable for me when I was doing self-assessments against codes, or I was assisting clients with new registrations with the regulator, that in particular when clients were either using the UK corporate code or clients were using the NHF code, that there were questions about governance that were left unanswered by the adoption of either of those codes. So in particular, I always felt a little bit nervous about those clients that had adopted the NHF code, because so much of that then required an explanation about why particular elements were not applicable, because almost by definition, the NHF code is drafted for a not-for-profit client base. And equally, for those clients that adopted the UK corporate code, I always felt slightly nervous that the resident voice, which is also important, wasn't being drawn out in the adoption of that code. So it's always seemed to me that the sector needed something specific. And I was lucky enough to have the sponsorship of the support of the BPS Affordable Housing Committee to engage the work of Campbell Tickell to write this code and to put some of my personal thoughts into practice. I think as we stand with a new government, the work that we've done with the code is actually even more important now, because new housing, new affordable housing is clearly front and absolute centre of the new government's agenda. And I think we all know the funding challenges that both the local authority sector and the housing association sector have got. So, if we're looking at annual targets of 360,000 homes, let's say very clearly a third of those are going to be affordable. I think we all know and accept that the housing association and local authority sector probably doesn't have the current financial capacity to deliver those 120,000 homes. So government, in my mind, has to look to institutional investors and the for-profit sector to bridge that gap. Yet I still think that despite the deployment and the very successful deployment of capital in the sector, there is still a bit of what I describe as a sniff test within the Labour Party about the use of private capital and the for-profit sector. And I do hope that the adoption of a bespoke code of governance, so that we as a sector can demonstrate to government that we are properly and seriously governed, is a big step towards engendering confidence with the new administration. And I think the final thing I'll say before I hand over to Greg is that we are increasingly seeing partnership working between the traditional housing association sector and institutional capital, the for-profit sector. And I think that the more we as a for-profit sector can demonstrate to the traditional sector that we are well governed, that we are serious about governance, the more those partnerships will flourish. So that's enough from me. I probably have whittled on for a little bit too long. Can I hand over to you now, please, Greg?
Thanks, Rob. And yes, good morning. Good morning, everybody. Before we get into the meat of the key topic of today's session, which my colleague Ceri is going to be talking you through, i.e. the Code of Governance, I thought it would be helpful to give you a few potted thoughts from my end, following on from Rob's comments about where we see the wider environment for profit registered providers. And I recognise in saying this that many of you here today will be very familiar with what I'm going to talk about, but I'm conscious that we've got an audience drawn from a number of different places, including non-RPs, funds that may be considering their involvement, organisations that are considering registration but haven't yet gone down that route, and also some non-profit organisations that are considering whether to establish a registered provider. Next slide, please, Ceri. So just a brief overview initially on the sort of numbers that are involved in the for-profit RP sector. We're now up to, I think I've got this right, 79 for-profit RPs, and there are a number more in the pipeline. The numbers have been increasing quite significantly this year. Interestingly, there were no new for-profit RPs registered in 2023. I mean, I think there are particular reasons for that, which we can go into if it's useful, but I'm not planning to. But we've had 10 so far this year, and there are a number of others that are likely to be coming through. So, excuse me, I think it's highly likely that we will be at more than 100 within about 3 years' time. Currently, I mean, it's a little difficult to track exactly, but what we reckon there are around 36,000 homes in the sector, and about half of those are shared ownership. The growth rates are quite significant, and major contrast here, while starting from a relatively speaking low base. The growth rates are quite significant, and we are potentially seeing increases in the total number of homes in the FPRP sector of around 40% a year. So we could well be looking at 100,000 plus homes in about 3 years' time. Having said that, there are only a limited number of significant players, and the great majority, as it says, of the homes in the sector are with 6 organisations, which are these are all from around about 1,000 homes upwards, and the largest has got sort of 12,000-13,000. And is planning to get to 30,000. We're expecting that number to the number of organisations operating at scale to increase quite significantly as major fundraisers come on stream. We've seen now that a number of or a small number of for-profits have reached and gone above the 1,000 homes threshold. We've seen the first few regulatory in-depth inspections by the regulator of social housing, and I think it's fair to say the results have been mixed, ranging from very good to somewhat challenging, and on a course to improvement. And we've seen a certain amount of grant from Homes England and the GLA under the 21 to 26 Affordable Homes Programme to build something like 6,500 homes, and that's just reserved, as things stand, to 5 for-profit recipients. Again, we're expecting numbers to increase over time. Next slide, please. Some thoughts on some of the key issues around the sector. There are while there are not a huge number of organisations, as I say, currently 79, they do come from different places, and a number have been established by institutions and funds. A number have been established by developers to retain control of the Section 106 on their new developments. Developers around about a third of the for-profit RPs. A small number so far have been established by existing non-profits and local authorities. As I say, not very many at all, but we are expecting numbers to increase. And others have been set up to deal with specific local circumstances. For example, a major regeneration in a particular area. You may well find that there's a for-profit RP has been established by the developer to deal with the affordable on that particular scheme. In terms of the tenures, as one might expect, some are specialising in general needs rented, so affordable, social or affordable, probably more likely affordable rented. Some are focusing on shared ownership exclusively. Some might be doing extra care, and others then again will offer a mix of tenures. And in part, the different types of tenures have led some large groups to establish more than one RP as part of their overall operations. I mean, the ones that have really focused on this have, of course, been Legal and General and Sage, who have between them, I think, established, I think I'm right in saying, 16 FPRPs in total, and those are about different investor profiles. Essentially, in terms of the delivery of housing management and property maintenance services, once organisations do have properties within their ownership, in most cases, that's in the great majority of cases, in fact, that's outsourced to third-party organisations. But it's fair to say that plans that we're seeing for some of the largest organisations, as they achieve scale, they are likely to be looking to take those activities in-house. Rob has mentioned the increase in partnership working between for-profits and non-profit RPs. And generally, I think it's fair to say that activity, and this is mirrored or reflected by the increase in the number of for-profits registered this year. Activity has been increasing quite significantly this year. Next slide, please, Ceri. This is the last slide that I'm going to be speaking to. I think it's useful to reflect a little bit on where we've seen changes in terms of the local government elected 2 months ago. As we know, the new government is talking about economic growth being the absolute #1 priority, and it's clear that housing is very much at the heart of it. We're expecting to see more devolution, so what's going on at local level is particularly important. It wasn't an accident that within the first few days after the new government was formed, we saw Starmer, Rayner and Reeves meeting all of the combined authority mayors. And it's clear that they are, to varying degrees, going to be expected to be significant in relation to housing in a way that they probably haven't been up to now. The government's ambitions are very significant. They're talking about 1.5 million new homes over 5 years, although they're expecting inevitably a slower start in the first year, which in turn leads to potential pressure down the line in the latter stages of the Parliament. But of course, there's a question of how those are going to be built, both in terms of funding and also in terms of who is going to be physically building the homes. New local housing targets are being reintroduced, focus on, as you would expect, brownfield development, but also grey belt, scruffy areas of green belt within green belt designation. Those will be the priorities. With the new national planning policy framework out for consultation at the moment. Crucially, in relation to investment, we are looking at, it's not been announced yet, but we'll be looking for an announcement in the budget on the 30th of October from Rachel Reeves, a 10-year rent settlement expected to be at CPI plus 1% for all social housing. And hopefully that will last rather longer than the settlement that George Osborne ripped up in 2015. We're likely to see some changes in the affordable homes programme. I think it's likely that there will be less funding available for shared ownership, more for social in particular, where schemes can be made to work, and affordable rent. New towns have been highlighted. That's probably part of a 10-year programme, to be honest. Street homelessness is going to be an important focus, and linked to that, the Housing First programme and a specialist unit being established in the Cabinet Office. The crucial point here, particularly perhaps with this audience, is the government has got huge ambitions, but very limited resources. New investment sources are critical, and that's why, for example, the cutting from the Municipal Journal, bottom right, this was actually ahead of the general election. Senior Labour people talking to the local government pension schemes. They have got significant ambitions and intentions in relation to wider engagement with those pension schemes, as well as with other institutional and commercial fund investors. And of course, this has been reflected in a number of fundraisers that have been done by for-profit RPs, and examples that come to mind, which have been quite public. Simply Affordable Homes, Octopus and their New Arch venture, Funding Affordable Homes Housing Association, Legal and General. There are others as well, but I think it's fair to say that the new government is keen to find all realistic sources of investment to help them deliver on their economic growth and housing priorities. And that's enough from me. Ceri, over to you.
Thanks, Craig. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Ceri Victory-Rowe from Campbell Tickell. And I can see actually that quite a few people have joined us since Rob opened the webinar. So just in terms of helping you to navigate where we are, Rob and Greg have been providing some context for the new Code of Governance, and I'm going to talk you through some of the detail about how we developed the code, or the thinking that informed the development of the code and what's in it. So Rob's already referred to the fact that it wasn't obvious that any other code of governance in existence, and there are quite a few, I've only got 3 listed here, there are considerably more than that are available to you as potential codes to adopt, but it wasn't obvious that any of them were actually really ideally fitted to the for-profit registered provider sector. And we did quite a bit of thinking about that early on in the work to develop a new code, just looking at what some of the pros and cons were of the codes that are out there. So as I say, I'm covering on this slide 3, but there are others, including the Waits Principles for large private companies. There's the Quoted Companies Alliance Corporate Governance Code and so on. But these are probably the usual suspects in terms of the codes that for-profit registered providers might have chosen to adopt. So the UK Corporate Governance Code, of course, very well regarded and well recognised, certainly for those working within the corporate world. But it's intended for companies with a premium listing on the London Stock Exchange. It is targeted at a particular type and nature of company, and that's not to say it can't be applied and applied well, actually, to other sorts of organisations. And there are even some non-profit making housing associations that have chosen to adopt it, but it isn't tailored to the sector. It doesn't, as Rob was saying earlier, reflect, for example, the requirement to place the needs, voice and safety of residents at the heart of how an organisation is governed, which is a fundamental expectation really in terms of good governance in a sector that is providing affordable housing in some shape or form. Then, of course, there's the National Housing Federation Code of Governance, which does exactly that. It does reflect very much the things that are particularly valued or expected in the governance of social housing providers, but very much orientated towards the non-profit providers. Target audience, clearly front and centre, housing associations. The National Housing Federation, for anyone who doesn't know, is the trade body for English housing associations. And this is their code. But again, very well regarded and recognised within the housing sector itself, and particularly tailored to it. There are some other options. So the ECODAR corporate governance guidance is perhaps the most obvious. This is guidance, set of guidance and principles for unlisted companies. ECODAR, for anyone not aware, is the European Confederation of Directors Associations. So an organisation trying to act as a European voice for board directors. Came up with this set of governance and principles for unlisted companies. It's a fairly high level set of principles, but on the plus side, there is some quite detailed practical guidance, certainly in some aspects of that guidance, which could be helpful to some organisations. But again, it isn't tailored to organisations providing affordable housing or indeed to the for-profit registered provider sector. And there are some ways in which, certainly, I think if you were minded to adopt it, you'd want to look very carefully at whether it aligns with sector and regulator expectations about good governance. So, for example, there are some provisions like permitting the creation of an advisory board during the early years of a company's existence, so at sort of startup stage, but in this sector that would be post-registration, where there are no non-executive directors appointed to the board, but a sort of a secondary advisory board that could fill some gaps in expertise. Now, I think, as I say, you'd want to think very carefully about whether that aligns with expectations of good governance in the sector. So we went into our work on this particular code thinking carefully about what we learned from looking at and our deep experience of working with other codes. I think the steering group was very minded to draw on the best of what's in those codes, as well as reflecting good practice in governance generally and in the sector. it was really critical that key considerations for-profit registered provider organisations were reflected. And I'll talk a bit more in a second about what some of those considerations are, because if you're going to write a code tailored to the sector, probably the more challenging bit of that is making sure that it really does reflect the nuances of arrangements in the sector. Reflecting wider good practice is fairly straightforward because there are lots of sources to draw on for that. There was also some really good discussion about how the code should align with what's already set out by the regulator of social housing. And the conclusion was that the code shouldn't replicate the regulatory standards, which are already clear in terms of the expectations set there, but should acknowledge regulatory context. And indeed, actually, the code acknowledges the need to comply with the regulatory standards and expectations. And then the last thing that was borne in mind, sort of front and centre in writing this, was to keep the code as clear and concise as possible. And just for a bit of context around that, the National Housing Federation Code is 9 pages. If you strip out the sort of topping and tailing, Corporate Governance Code 11 pages. This code comes in at 11 pages, so it's in the same ballpark as other codes. Very difficult to write a shorter code, although we did recognise that if we hadn't started each section a new page, it could have been even shorter. But we didn't choose to do that, so there is some white space on the pages. I said I'd talk a bit more about things that we were particularly mindful of in terms of some of the unique factors that make this a distinct sector in its own right, a for-profit registered provider sector. And the steering group were invaluable to us in that, and in sort of steering us on a good course through some of the complexities there. The first thing is just, I think, the nature of your sector as commercial entities also providing a social good, and that can create some complexities, some tensions even, that need to be navigated in terms of good governance. Part of that is meeting the expectations of both shareholder or shareholders, if you have any, and the regulator, and the fact that those might not always align in a way that's helpful to you, and ensuring that the way in which the RP is led and controlled is understood in the context of the relationship with the shareholder and some of the complexities that can come with that, and the relationship with the parent, if there's a group structure within which you've got to operate, or the relationship with connected companies who might, for example, be providing services to the RP, and some of the governance complexities that can come with a complex group structure or an extensive group structure, and the relationships between the different bits of that, and what that means for the board of a for-profit registered provider. In particular, the extent of the control and autonomy that it has. And I think it's fair to say that there was quite a good degree of discussion about that in the development of the code. And you can see that reflected in the very first bit of the code, which is about the board establishing and promoting the RP's purpose and strategy. The first line is, first expectation is that the board understands the ambition and expectations of its shareholders for the RP, and the second line is that the board establishes and articulates the strategy for the RP. And of course, the intention there is that that strategy is articulated in the context, the clear context of the expectations of the shareholder. So there was lots to think about there. There was also thought to give to what you say about oversight of delivery where that takes place through third parties, so that we know that lots of for-profit registered providers are set up so that services are delivered through contracts with third parties, sometimes connected companies, as I've said, sometimes not. Sometimes the RP itself doesn't employ any staff directly, so there are complicated arrangements to manage there in the context of regulatory expectations and expectations around good governance. So some thought was given to that too, and then to responsibilities and relationships with residents, which was a thread, of course, through the code, given the nature of the business of providing affordable housing to people who need a voice, and how decisions are made about that housing. But actually, there's particular consideration to in relation to the nature of the homes that many of you deliver, particularly where those are largely low-cost home ownership. So that's not an exhaustive list of the things that we were thinking about, but they were some of the characteristics of the sector that we wanted to make sure were reflected carefully in the code. And so we came up with a code which had 7 sections. You can see them here. I'm not going to read these out because I've got another slide that gives a little bit more detail about what sits underneath each of these. So, and my apologies because this is a horrible slide to read on screen, but you will have this afterwards and I'll walk you through it. So, section number 1, top left-hand side, leadership and strategy. So this is the section that opens with the wording I just read out to you about purpose, clarity of purpose and strategy, including clarity about stakeholder expectations and how those need to be met. It's also the section that covers board authority and control over decisions and the extent of that. And there's some content around sustainability, which in particular refers to financial sustainability, but also, of course, as you would expect, refers to environmental sustainability, and particularly in the context of environmental, social, and governance expectations, ESG. The second section is about culture and values, and this is something that has really risen up the agenda in terms of codes of governance over probably the last 5 to 10 years. With increasing emphasis as different codes of governance have been revised. You see that in the UK Corporate Governance Code, you can see it in the National Housing Federation Code, because even though boards on a day-to-day basis can feel quite removed from the culture of the organisation because they tend to work largely in isolation from those who work from it, except when they meet as a board with very senior staff, actually, as I'm always saying to boards, what they do casts a very long shadow in any organisation. And so that requirement, as well as the fact that culture is so fundamental to the success of any organisation, you know, the kind of cliched but true fact that culture eats strategy for breakfast means that boards ignore culture at their peril, because you can't succeed as an organisation if you don't get the culture right. So there's some content there about the board's role in relation to culture and values. And as part of that, placing the safety of residents, of staff, and so on at the centre of that, as well as placing significant importance on equality, diversity and inclusion, and on engaging with stakeholders. So this is the bit that Rob was referring to earlier that is missing from the more standard corporate codes, is the engaging with, in particular with residents, and ensuring that their voices are heard. Section 3 is about board composition and effectiveness. So this is paying attention to the size of the board, the fact that it's got the right skills and diverse characteristics collectively around the table, and that proper attention is paid to the way in which board appointments are made, the way that board member performance, development and succession planning are managed. And then the effective conduct of the business of the board itself, making sure there are arrangements in place that are appropriate to support that, and that there are sound arrangements in place to manage and set the levels of non-executive director remuneration where that's relevant. There's a section 4 that follows on from that on the right-hand side of my slide, board roles and functions. So this section talks a bit about what effective leadership on the part of the board should look like, and in particular that there should be clarity about leadership roles and about responsibilities of the board and individuals who are appointed to roles from within the board's membership. There's a section which sets out matters that should be reserved for the board's responsibility. So in other words, things that the board will do and it won't delegate. But there's also provision there for delegation, and in particular for establishing committees. Section 5 deals with delivery of strategy and service. So this is the actual implementation. And of course, as a code of governance, this isn't about the detail of how any of you might implement strategy, but it is about how the board makes sure that strategy is implemented in line with its expectations, with the expectations of the regulator. So ensuring that homes and services are of high quality, that there's robust oversight of performance, and also that there is appropriate control over operational delivery. And that goes back to that point I raised earlier about the potential sometimes for services to be delivered through third parties, and the extent of the control that is reasonable to expect the board to exert over that. Section 6 is something you'd expect to see in any good code of governance, which is something about standards of probity and conduct, including openness and transparency. There's provision there for arrangements around whistleblowing, and also the firm expectation that the board should ensure compliance with the code should you choose to adopt it. And then finally, a section on audit and risk, again, common to many codes of governance, setting out what good practice looks like in terms of making arrangements for audit, how to manage the relationship with an audit committee, and again, reflecting the particular nature of the sector. There is some reference there to how you might manage arrangements where you discharge your audit function through a committee that is not actually a committee of the RP. It might be a committee of a parent within a wider group structure, for example. So we've tried to make sure that that section of the code, as with others, is as flexible as possible to recognise the range of different types and structures that you might be working within. And then there's some content about risk management and expectations set out there, as well as the fundamental expectation that there is compliance with legal and regulatory expectations. So that's a bit of a canter through what is set out over 11 pages, or a bit less if you take out the white spaces, of the code. But we've tried to set it out clearly, logically, give it a logical flow. And the way, for those of you who haven't read it, and I think about 60% said in the initial survey that they haven't read it yet, what you'll find when you do is that each of the 7 themes I've just talked you through is set out with principles underneath them. So here's an example. Theme 1 is leadership and strategy. The first principle under that 1A is that the board establishes and promotes the RP strategy. So again, this is the example we've already talked through. Here are the first 2 of the detailed expectations that sit underneath that. Okay, and so you can see that each theme has a set of principles, and then below those follow the detailed expectations. So what does all of this mean for you? Well, there's a choice for you about which code of governance you adopt, but there is a requirement if you register with the regulator of social housing, set as part of the governance and financial viability standard, that you will adopt a code of governance. It's required to be an appropriate code, and our hope is that this would be considered to be one. We can't offer you any guarantee on the part of the regulator that they would consider it as such. We did talk with the regulator in the development of the code, as well as working with, as Rob has said, representatives from across the sector on the steering group. So a considerable amount of thought has gone into this, accepting that, just as Rob said, there will, of course, need to be some further development as time goes on and as this has been tested out in the sector. We consider that it is better tailored to the sector than other codes. That was the whole point, is that this should work for you and work across a range of types and sizes of organisations. But of course, as with any code, there will be pros and cons. You know, I could add it to that table I had of pros and cons, and I'm sure we could find some things to put in both boxes. Some of that for you might be thinking about how much of this is just writing down, stating the obvious, you know, it's stuff we all do, we're all familiar with how to do this, and how much of it might feel like a stretch or more effort to comply with. And again, we asked you about that in the poll, and I think there was a spread of answers with lots of you landing in the middle, of course, inevitably when we give you a middle option. But I think that probably suggests that, you know, people are thinking through the fact that there'll probably be some work to do to comply, but hopefully not too overly onerous. If you do want to adopt it, when you get to that point, the basis on which the code works is that you should comply or explain. So there is provision to explain with a reasoned argument why you might have put in place an alternative arrangement to a particular provision in the code, but otherwise the expectation is that you would comply fully with everything that is in the code. So in other words, you'd need a really good reason why you shouldn't comply with a particular element of the code. We have said in the wording of the code that there is intended to be some flexibility for smaller providers, and I know there's already been a question about that, and I think the reality is we haven't worked through the detail of that. There isn't any detailed guidance at this point to support the code. I think the expectation would be, and certainly the expectation that was written with, is that smaller providers, and we're talking really, you know, I think really small, because the expectation is that for most organisations it should be possible to comply with this. But with really small organisations, the point would be to comply as fully with the spirit of the code as you possibly can, and to again have a really clear reasoned argument where there's something that you can't comply with because of your size, or it isn't appropriate to attempt to comply with because of your size, but that you have something in place that essentially serves the same purpose. Which is in essence what the guidance for the National Housing Federation Code of Governance 2020 says in the more detailed guidance that it provides for smaller providers. You know, it really is a matter of common sense in most cases about what it would be reasonable for you to achieve and what it wouldn't. And we can always return to that more in the Q&A session later. If you want to go ahead with, if you choose to adopt this code or to change from a code you've previously adopted to adopting this one, what do you need to do to get that process going? Well, our suggestion would be, and of course there's no right and wrong here, but start with what you're aiming to achieve as an organisation, you know, that bit about stakeholder expectations, what are you trying to be, what plans have you got? Then consider whether in that context this feels like the right code for you. If you think that it is, then a good first step is to carry out a more detailed compliance assessment against the code. So go through each area of the code, think about how you would, what evidence you've got that would help you to demonstrate that you comply with it. And then you and your board can consider that, think about, you know, precise that, how much is what we already do, how much is stuff we can easily manage, and what might feel like a stretch. And then thinking about that, think about when you intend to adopt. So typically you'd adopt at the start of a new financial year so that in your financial statements you can then declare a full year of compliance. But of course there's no real reason why you can't choose to adopt it midway through a year and work towards compliance for the full following year. Have a plan for filling any compliance gaps, so it's really clear where there are gaps, what you're doing about those, and when you expect to be able to fully comply. And then formal adoption of the code, of course, is important. You'd expect your board to do that, to formally approve adoption of the code from the date you've chosen. And then importantly, to review progress periodically. So, of course, compliance at one point in time is no guarantee that you'll continue to comply. So revisiting that, we typically suggest good practice would be once a year. Make sure you do repeat your self-assessment of compliance. Come back to the board with that, or to the audit committee if that feels more appropriate. Make sure that that's fully understood and any gaps are understood. You've got a plan to address them, and potentially periodically seek external assurance about compliance so the board has got that extra level of third line assurance. So hopefully that's given you lots to think about. I can see some questions are coming through. So what I might do is just take our slides down at this point, Rob, and hand back to you.
Super. Thank you very much, Ceri. And I think it's great to hear sort of, I suppose, the process that we went through in devising the code sort of repeated back to us. I think it really does emphasise the thinking and the graph that went into devising this. And, you know, from a BPF perspective, we're hugely grateful for the work that you did there. Some interesting questions, I think, as you alluded to, Ceri, and I think, you know, Linda's question about the fact that there may be expectations that the baby apply a little bit more flexibly by small providers is an important one. And I think the way that you articulated the fact that ultimately the spirit and the intention of the code has to push through is important there. And I think it's worth emphasising that one of the thought processes that we went through as a steering group is that we quite deliberately set the barrier quite high in devising this code. This was not ever intended to be a code that is all things to all people, because I think if the code is going to serve its purpose, it has to be an exacting code. And in recognition of that, we are fully conscious that it won't be right for everybody. And in particular, there will be, you know, smaller SME developers, for example, that may be more comfortable with a different code. So we have set the bar deliberately high. But I think, you know, in response to Linda's question, I think, you know, one of the sections that immediately springs to mind, for example, are the arrangements in relation to audit. And we know for our work with clients that it's not always appropriate to establish an audit committee if you've got a small board. But we would expect the board to be absolutely front and centre in relation to the audit of its accounts and the audit of its services. So, I hope you can sort of understand there that whilst you may not have an audit committee, the principles that are articulated in the code in relation to audit are absolutely fundamentally important. Question back to you, Ceri, from Heather about a checklist. I think the intention is that we will produce a checklist. We've not done it yet.
Yeah, we'd certainly be very happy to do that.
And then a question from Sarah, which is a good one, which is, do we see this as replacing or complementing other codes? I think the answer there, Ceri, is that we very much see this as a standalone code. I don't think the regulator would look particularly kindly on an RP that sort of does a greatest hits and picks and chooses the bits of codes that it likes and discards the bits that it doesn't like. So I think our intention, Ceri, is that this is a standalone code that stands off all on its own merits.
Yes, indeed. I mean, we occasionally work with some extremely diligent clients who decide to adopt one and self-assess their compliance against some others too. So if you want to take a really belt and braces approach, you could attempt to comply with more than one at the same time, but certainly picking and choosing bits of codes we wouldn't suggest would be good practice. And the intention is that this is a complete code. It should more than adequately replace any of those other codes in terms of being a complete account of what we would expect to see as a baseline of good governance in any for-profit registered provider. There's a really important point in that, which is that that's not to say you couldn't do more, but this is the very minimum that we would expect would look like good practice in a for-profit.
And then a good question from John: do we notify the regulator of a change of code? I mean, it would seem to me, I think, two fundamentals there. We don't have to notify, but to take the point that Ceri made, first of all, in my mind, it has to be a board decision. This is one of those things that I think sits at a board level rather than at a shareholder level. And of course, the adoption of the code and compliance with the code is something that needs to be disclosed in your accounts under the regulatory framework. So no to a notification, but transparency and deep breath, very well documented minutes about the change of the code and the rationale for the change of code, I think, is fundamentally important.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree. I mean, of course, it's something that if when you're having a periodic routine catch up with the regulator, you could mention just to let them know, but there's no requirement to notify.
Please do keep the questions coming on the Q&A box. I mean, I think one of the things that has struck me, Ceri, and would welcome your thoughts on this, is that when we work with clients who have appointed non-executives from the not-for-profit housing association sector, there's a sense that there is a different way of governing, or a different sort of a different way that boards behave in the for-profit sector. I wonder if you could sort of just say a few words about your experience and how we've tried to articulate some of that in the code.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think our experience is it can feel very different for people. And some of that, I think, is just straightforwardly cultural. It's that there is a slightly different culture around the boards of commercial companies generally than the boards, certainly of the social housing sector. And a different expectation in terms of ways of doing things. So even in practical terms, we see, for example, people coming from the commercial sector surprised at the length of board papers in the social housing sector, and that's partly because of the thoroughness that's expected in terms of governance from the regulator, but it's also, of course, to some extent, habit and accepted practice. So there are just some differences culturally in terms of the way people think about their governance roles and go about them practically. And then there's the way that the sector is structured. So that relationship with a shareholder or the operation within a group structure. There are group structures, of course, in the non-profit housing association or a registered provider sector, but the relationships can be different. And I think the balance of responsibilities across shareholders and board can can just feel unfamiliar and a bit tricky to navigate if you're not used to it. So that's one of the differences. And the need to balance those shareholder expectations with the interests of the RP. And then there's something similar about reconciling regulatory expectations and those commercial practices or ways of working, or more commercially orientated practices that I talked about. And then there's the thing I mentioned about working through third parties, which again is probably a little bit more frequent in the for-profit sector, whereas I mentioned previously, actually, it may be that even that the RP itself doesn't directly employ any staff. And again, that can feel different. That can feel different in terms of how the relationships and the lines of accountability and communication work. So I think there are quite a number of ways in which it can feel different. There are also, of course, some ways in which it can feel really familiar. Because ultimately, the at least part of the purpose is the same.
Brilliant, thank you. Really good question here from Georgina. How do we think the regulator's approach to governance of for-profits could change over the next 3 to 5 years? And is the code future-proofed? So good question. I'm going to hand that over to Greg to start with. I'm going to give some thoughts to my thoughts on that, and then I'll bring in Ceri. But initial views from you, Greg?
It is an interesting question. Sorry, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yes. It is an interesting question. I'm not sure that the government has grappled with it yet. We anticipate that the general thrust of the approach to regulation that's been developed over the last few years, particularly as reflected in the 2023 Act on social housing regulation, that will continue. Obviously, the major focus there has been around consumer regulation. Having said that, the regulator's attitude to and approach to FPRPs has changed quite significantly, and has become, I think it's fair to say, more sophisticated over time. The first FPRPs were registered around 2012 to 2014. The regulator put in place a specialist for-profits unit in 2020, 4 years ago. I think that they will be looking closely to see how the sector develops over the next few years. As for the question of to what extent the code is future-proofed, we'd anticipated in drawing up the code that, and Ceri referred to this a few minutes ago, the code will need to be reviewed in practice, and based on the experience of organisations that adopt it, as well as indications from elsewhere, such as from the regulator. I would have thought a review something like 1 to 2 years after implementation of the code, and where any adjustments need to be made to reflect practice. I would have thought that makes perfectly good sense.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that, Greg. I would particularly share that view that actually the regulator is already adapting its approach to for-profits. And I think those of you that have been through the registration process over the last 5 or 6 years will recognise that the barriers to entry to get registration in the first place are now materially higher, and the expectations of governance are materially higher than they were a decade ago when the first FPRPs were being registered. So I think that there is already an inherent professionalisation of the sector, and I think if we see a reiteration of the governance and financial viability standard with greater expectations on the for-profit sector, then I think that will form part of that. I think we can also learn a little bit from some of the very public IDAs that have taken place in the sector. And I think we can already see some concerns from the regulator about making sure that boards are on top of liquidity, and in particular that they do have access to their own cash if circumstances require that. And I think we saw in the sector risk profile that was published last year about the concerns that the regulator has about the outsourcing of services. Nothing inherently wrong with the outsourcing of services, but really make sure that you do have the governance arrangements in place to make sure that the quality of the services, and this is, it's not just housing management services, it's also corporate services, that they are properly interrogated, and to take the sort of political phrase of the moment, making sure that the service provider isn't marking their own homework. So making sure that you're fully on top of outsourced services, I think, is an increasing feature of governance in the for-profit sector. Ceri, did you have anything to add to Greg and I's musings?
No, I mean, I think I agree with what you've both said, that I think so I don't think we're expecting to see change necessarily. We're not going to see, for example, a different set of regulatory standards for-profit registered providers. I think the expectation is that they should meet the standards that the rest of the sector meet. But I think where we're seeing change, and we'll continue to see some changes through registration, so the point at which those organisations enter the sector, and in regulatory engagement, so the way in which the regulator works with for-profits to interpret the regulatory standards in the particular context, the way that you're structured and operate. So, and then we know that that's evolving. So the regulator's understanding of the different business models that you've got and operate is developing, and the extent to which those might or might not be considered to be compliant because they deliver the outcomes expected by the regulatory standards. So I'm sure that will continue to evolve. And the regulator, as well as the sector, is learning from the work that's been done around the early IDAs, and know the amount of effort that they've put into that. Yeah, so that's where I would expect that we see changes.
Good question from Jack there about the scrutiny when you sort of do comply or explain. And I think that's a really important point, because there will be areas, just in is the case with the NHF code, that there will be areas where you have made a very conscious decision not to comply, or that you simply can't comply because of the circumstances of your own organisation. And I think in drafting the code, we're very conscious of the fact that there will be particular circumstances which mean the boards can't comply or have chosen not to comply. I think the key thing there, and this is in response to Jack and to all of the delegates, is that there is a reasoned, rational reason for that non-compliance. So, it sounds a bit trite, but don't use that as an excuse just because something's a bit pressing or a bit exacting. There has to be a sound reason for it. And, we've come up with some very practical examples. So, for example, you may be part of a fund structure or a group structure where the remuneration of non-executive directors is governed in a different part of the group. You have no control over the level of remuneration for your non-executives, simply because the way that your organisation, the way that your corporate group is set up, is that there is a benchmarking exercise which is undertaken at a group-wide level. And that's absolutely fine, because that's the circumstances of your group. But you need to be conscious of that fact and accept that that means that you're not in compliance with that particular bit of the code. Equally, you may be governed by a recruitment process for non-execs, which is governed elsewhere in the group. So the idea that the board is in complete control of its own destiny may simply not be right for your particular organisation. But I think the critical thing is that you do address that head on, and you do specifically rationalise the reason why you may not be compliant. Ceri, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, I suppose the question about the level of scrutiny or engagement, I mean, presumably that's a question about regulatory scrutiny or engagement, because if there is scrutiny or engagement, that's where it's likely to come from. And there's something there about the cumulative impact of taking on alternative arrangements. So if there's one aspect of the code with which you don't comply and you've got a sound reason for that, as Rob says, then it's unlikely we can't speak for the regulator, but it's unlikely that's going to significantly trip you up. If there are lots of areas where you consider that you don't comply, And if, for example, the reason for that was, as Rob's indicated, that actually all of those things are controlled elsewhere, then that might cause a bit of pause for thought, because there is a fundamental principle here about the board of the RP having adequate control over what the RP does and the arrangements that are made for it, and that those align with the expectations of the regulator and sort of what would be considered good practice in the sector. So I think there are some nuances there, and the advice we would just give is exactly as Rob said: think really carefully about any areas where you can't comply. And be really careful in explaining those, documenting them, making sure the board is aware and has agreed that, and you've all got an agreed narrative around it.
That's great. Thanks, Ceri. Really good question. Have we seen any adopters, any providers adopt the code? The simple answer to that is that we've got no visibility of anyone that's actually pressed the button yet, unless Ceri has seen otherwise. And in a way, that's not particularly surprising, because we only published this back in June, and we're not yet in the cycle ahead of in most cases a 31 March year end of adoption. That said, we are working with a number of clients that are looking to adopt, and I think that the framework that Ceri outlined is absolutely fundamental to that. And I think the first port of call for any board that is looking at this is to say, let's do a piece of work which compares and contrasts this code with the other codes, or the code that you've already adopted. And before you go too far down that line, actually make sure that this is the right decision for you before you get into the detail of adoption. Ceri, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think that was very clear.
Very, very good question from you, Elizabeth. Potential conflicts between the FPRP and the investor about, for example, on rent setting. That's a really good question. I'm going to bring Greg in a minute about that, because I'm passing the difficult questions to Greg. You can see that. From my perspective, I think this really goes to the absolute heart of one of the fundamental features of this code, which is not articulated in the UK Corporate Code or in the NHF Code, which is the point that Ceri made earlier about understanding the objectives of the shareholder and actually making sure that you are aligned with the shareholder's strategy. Because I think one of the things which is different for the for-profit sector to the not-for-profit sector is that you do have, ultimately this is the shareholder's money. You are not in, as a board of a for-profit, you are not quite in control of your own destiny in the way that you are in the not-for-profit sector, where if you want to chart a different path, or for example on rents, that's fully within your discretion. You don't have to, providing you're compliant with the rent standard and you're compliant with your Section 106 agreements, you don't have to go and get somebody else's permission to chart a different course. Here, it is fundamentally something which I think has to be discussed with with the shareholder, and a path agreed with the shareholder, because ultimately it goes to the heart of the fact that it is the shareholder's money. And therefore, that's why we've been so explicit in the code about making sure that the board do understand the objectives of the shareholder. Interestingly, though, Elizabeth, when actually this actually came to pass, particularly with shared ownership rent increases, which weren't mandated by the rent standard a couple of years ago, it was the dog that didn't bark. Most boards and shareholders actually reached an aligned position with the NHF position. So it was interesting that actually the first potential pinch point actually really didn't come to pass. Greg, did you have any thoughts?
Well, yeah, a couple. One, I'd just like to refer back to some of the clauses in the code that Ceri referred to earlier. So the very first one, right at the beginning, under leadership and strategy in the first principle, the board understands the ambition and expectations of its shareholder or shareholders for the RP. And secondly, the board establishes and articulates the strategy for the RP. In addition, for the next principle, the board has the authority to exercise appropriate control over decisions about resourcing the delivery strategy, including business plans and budgets. There are going to be there are going to be differences of view at different points, almost certainly around these sorts of issues, and the organisation and its parent, its shareholders, need to reach a reasonable accommodation on how to deal with these. The other point I would just make in relation to Elizabeth's specific question around rent setting is, of course, the regulator has a rent standard, and rent setting will need to have regard to the requirements in line with that, and it is quite a tricky area.
I think the other thing I would say is that actually there's probably merit in rehearsing some of those difficult questions before they become real.
Yes.
So that there's almost a bit of a stress testing exercise between the board and the shareholders, so that you can play out those sort of those potential scenarios. We've just done some work with a client that has done some stress testing on what I describe as, it's not very technical, so apologies, but the concept of lumpy capex. So what would happen if capital expenditure came along which wasn't forecast in the business plan? How would that be addressed? And I think it's incumbent on boards to tackle those sorts of difficult questions quite early on with the shareholder, which sort of segues quite neatly into Steve's question about organisations that are going through the going through the registration process. And I think the point there is that two things. I think first of all, it's incumbent on any organisation that's going through the registration process to make a conscious decision about which code of governance to adopt. And to make sure that the board are in control of that decision, and that there is a reasoned and well-considered adoption of one code or another. But secondly, it is a requirement during the registration process that you have undertaken a self-assessment exercise, so that hopefully some of those sort of avoiding the surprises comments there are avoided, because you've gone through that process and you've actually demonstrated compliance with a chosen code. Ceri, is there anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. I think one of the things that's really important in all of this is real clarity from the outset about roles and responsibilities. So I think too often one of the things we see is organisations very early post-registration haven't actually worked out who's responsible for what the lines of communication are, for example, between the board and the shareholder, and so on. And being really clear about that from day one, I think is very helpful. It can almost feel too early, there's sort of a sense that you need to get things off the ground and get going, and then we can work out quite where the responsibilities lie and so on. But it trips organisations up, and it can mean that where you do get a conflict, like the example of rent setting, that it's more difficult to navigate than it would otherwise be, particularly if the lines of communication point, I think, is a really important one. Who is responsible for accessing the expectations of the shareholder and actually understanding them and making sure they're articulated to the board in the right way? Who's responsible for that more routine communication? So in some structures that's really obvious and clear, but in others it isn't, and then you find that actually the right conversations haven't taken place, no one's quite sure how to make them happen, and so on. So I think, yeah, roles, responsibilities and communication clear from the outset, it will really help with some of this stuff.
Can I just add on the point about registration? It is, the regulator is going to regard it as fairly fundamental that the organisation is clear on which code of governance it's adopting and why, and how it complies and what the evidence is. And bluntly, if one hasn't got to the point of being able to answer all of those questions at a key stage of the registration, the process is going to be delayed.
Yeah, entirely agree with that, Greg. Entirely agree. Yeah, it's something that actually the regulator would not look kindly on whatsoever. Yeah. Julia's question is a good one about about adoption of the code. And I think, Julia, it sort of almost goes without saying that
yes,
the adoption of a code would be something that would need to be developed in cooperation with the shareholder. Because I think if it does mean that the relationship with the shareholder would need to change as a result, then I think fundamentally you would need to consult with the shareholder as a fundamental stakeholder in your business.
Yeah.
I'm less concerned about the fact that your group may have adopted a different code. I think that's almost sort of accepted and is almost sort of taken for granted, because this is a different sector. This is, you've got different stakeholders, you've got different expectations of governance. So I'm less concerned about the fact that you may have a parent with a different code.
I think what that does flag, Rob, is that sometimes there are issues for for-profit RPs where the parent has adopted different code because the parent, in situations where the parent is dictating the larger scale governance arrangements that are in place, some of which the RP may be using. So, for example, making use of an audit committee, making use of other committees. And so what I think Julia's suggestion about making sure that the shareholder board is engaged does really well is make sure that there's an open conversation about that. It's another opportunity, isn't it, to flag the fact that there are different regulatory expectations from the RP than will apply to the wider group or to the shareholder. And having the discussion about the code of governance then means that you can make sure the work's done practically within the organisation to make sure that the RP is properly supported to comply with the code. Even though that might be different from the governance expectations for the rest of the group.
Yeah. Eugene, how have we engaged with the regulator? Yes, we have. The regulator saw 2 earlier drafts of the code, actually provided some very, very helpful feedback, which we have incorporated into the code. So we are hugely grateful for the input that the regulator made into the development of the code.
Rob, can I just add? The regulator would not endorse this code or any other code. The most that one could expect is that the regulator would acknowledge that this is a code of governance. The regulator has given us that acknowledgement. So on that basis, we were content.
I'm quite deliberately going to duck the next question about Kiero's and Rachel's lessons learned on the registration process, because that's slightly off-piste in terms of the purpose of this morning's webinar. But whoever that anonymous attendee was, feel free to reach out to Greg, Ceri, or I offline. But we're not going to tackle that question now. In the absence of additional questions, Greg, can I just hand back to you for some final thoughts, and then I'll do the same with Ceri, and then we'll wrap up.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks to everybody who's stuck with us. I think that very few have dropped off, so we're grateful for your involvement. We hope that you found this a useful session. We will be sending out the recording. We are sharing the recording, I think, and we're certainly sending out the slides to all participants. And as Rob has indicated, he or Ceri or I will be very happy to have any further discussions where any further clarification is needed. We will also include, as part of that sort of little pack for attendees, a link to the code itself, which is available it's available on the BPF website. It's also available on the Campbell Tickell website. One other specific I would mention. Rob talked earlier about joint working, partnership working, and so forth between for-profits and non-profit registered providers. And last December, and indeed the year before, we did have a joint seminar between Trowers, Devonshire's Social Invest, and Campbell Tickell, looking at those sort of issues. We are, planning another such seminar. It's likely to be I think it's possibly the 4th of December. There'll be further details to come, exploring issues not just around partnership, but more broadly for the for-profit sector, funds and their involvement and so on. So more to come on that in due course. Thank you.
Super. Any final thoughts from you, Ceri?
No, just to say, I hope this feels like a really good opportunity for the sector to work with something that actually is tailored to you. And I think it's an exciting point in the recognition that the sector's here to stay and is doing good things and so on. So we felt really pleased to work on this.
Super. Thanks, Ceri. Thanks, Greg. And I think, Ceri, you've just articulated exactly what I was about to conclude on, which is, in my mind, the adoption of this code and the preparation of this code really shows a maturing sector. And I think this is a sector whose time has come and is coming of age. So the fact that we've had so many delegates that have spent an hour and a half on a Wednesday morning learning more about it, I really do think shows that the sector is taking its role seriously and it's taking its governance seriously. So thank you to everybody that joined. And yeah, happy to take any of these debates offline. Thank you.